Oh, the Balance Manifesto, a source of controversy. Pretty much every league, and every league I kind of feel pretty much the same about it. Not the same every single time, there's nuance to that, right? Sometimes they're specifically different than others, but it's the same reaction of if it's a nerf, there is just panic and blood in the streets and everybody's freaking out. And there's something to be mad about in this manifesto. There's something that is legitimately frustrating and not cool. But overall, the large amount of these changes in the manifesto, fairly reasonable and fairly deserved. The change, I'll start with the non-controversial statement, which is this change here, this stuff is a joke, right? This is spitting in your face. We took 10 completely unusable crap skills and gave them 10% more damage. Great. They're still completely trash. And then there's like a couple updates that are kind of nice. The Sunder one, maybe it makes Sunder playable. The Shock Nova one, that's at least interesting. It's a mechanical change. The Haste, okay, Haste is maybe a viable aura now. Probably still not competitive for 50% aura reservation. But overall, getting stuff like Cleave plus 2 radius, no one plays Cleave with an extra 2 radius. That doesn't matter. Giving 10% more damage to something like Firestorm, if that's what that ends up equating to, doesn't matter. Because if it's so bad that it's not even on the table of consideration, giving it 10% more is never going to make it a choice on the table. This is just what actually is uninteresting about this whole manifesto, or not something I can get behind, is if you go to say, I'm going to buff underused skills, and your buff is, I'm going to still make a skill that's 50 times worse than a lot of good skills, it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant, and this isn't making anyone go play different skills, because these changes largely aren't strong enough to do that. There are skills that Blazing Salvo, for example, is viable, and now it's a little bit stronger, and that's cool, right? This is a usable skill, and it becomes more usable. But taking things like the Decoy Totem, Devouring Totem, Rejuvenating Totem, all that sort of stuff, you have to do some significant changes to even make those changes something that people will care about. And plus 2 radius cleave, stuff like that isn't going to do it, right? This is something I can understand, and I think there's legitimate reason to be upset about, right? But all the other hate, all the other like blow-ups across the board I'm seeing on Reddit, on YouTube comments, on reaction videos, I think it's absurd, or it's a straw man argument, or it's overstated or exaggerated. For example, I go through like the Reddit, for example, and I look for, I don't know, this post, most updated post in the past 19 hours, 3.2k upvotes, is a guy complaining about, oh, this nerfs the newer players, it nerfs defenses completely, we're dying every map now. It's like, it paints this very like grim picture of having our defenses ripped from us, and the newer player is the guy that got punished. And it doesn't relate to what's actually in the manifesto at all. For example, newer player, they're not getting suppressed in their gear. Newsflash, it's not happening. This is, although easy to get arguably to spell suppress cap with your gear, it's still expensive to get gear that's decent with spell suppress. It's not a cheap stat, and newer players can't afford that, and they're probably not even like going on a PoE trade to try to buy it. What they can get is small passes on the tree, and that got buffed across the board. The whole change here was basically saying spell suppress is no longer ubiquitously mandatory if you're min-maxing a character, because it's not relevant to be able to do that unless you have a character that gets evasion side of the tree stuff, where you can get passives to support it, sort of thing. It brings spell suppress to what it was meant to be. Evasion characters, they have a way to deal with attacks, but they don't have a way to deal with spells. They're generally characters that don't get a lot of life on their side of the tree, so they need some decent mitigation, and evasion has a lot of mitigation for attacks, and spell suppress is good mitigation for spells. But builds on the other side of the tree that can't feasibly get the spell suppress, they get higher HP, they get the ability to build hybrid, they get the ability to go max res, they can go mind over matter, although mind over matter is in a rough space right now, but you get the point. The point is, the evasion side desperately needs spell suppress, where the other side, you can do the content without spell suppress. I've had plenty of builds able to do uber content without spell suppress. It isn't mandatory to do the content. To say it's mandatory is just, frankly, it's a lie. It's not true. And I think you can't say this if you don't play a bunch of different builds and experiment and actually, you can't argue that it's mandatory if you don't even know what can be done in PoE in terms of taking builds that aren't even meta and still doing the uber content and doing it without spell suppress sort of thing. I think it's disingenuous to say spell suppress is mandatory to do the game. If you're a softcore player, I think that's completely ridiculous. If you're hardcore, that's a different game. You're playing the game on hardcore, you get a harder game. Guess what? You might need to max into spell suppress and you might need to build around that. You're playing hardcore, you chose that life, I can't help you there. Now, Arctic Armor, this is a buff. Defenses are buffed, and it's a solid buff. This is an aura I will now consider using. It gives you the scenario where I can potentially take a build, not run determination, and still have okay phys mitigation enough to tank stuff like a Shaper Slam. And for the most part, I know while stationary is a feels bad stat, for the most part, I'm not getting hit unless I'm standing still, because the way PoE works is enemies generally are attacking in the spot you were in, which means that attack or spell doesn't hit you. If you're standing still, that's when you get hit, and that's when you need the mitigation. So I think for the most part is fairly solid. For 25% reservation, this will be an include for a lot of builds I'll do. Plus it gives you freeze immunity, which is nice as well. And then there's other things like buffing Flesh and Stone. This is only kind of mediocre. It's solid. There's stuff like buffing, nerfing Defiance banner. This one's completely, in my opinion, deserved. Defiance banner was a ubiquitous, every build takes this because of how strong it was. Even with what it is now, it's still a aura I'm probably going to consider running in a lot of builds if I'm running Grace or I'm running Determination. It's 10% reservation, and what you get for 10% reservation is arguably quite strong. The reduced critical strike chance, which is a strong part of Defiance banner, actually got buffed. They nerfed the armor and evasion rating, which is the abusable case of scaling into just crazy amounts of armor and evasion to ignoring the content sorts of levels type of thing. So this is a reasonable nerf, especially when you go and you look at builds on Sentinel League and you look at skills they use, and Defiance banner is in 75% of builds. That tells you this skill isn't a choice. It's so good, it's ubiquitous. Everyone uses it. That's how good it is. And arguably, that's something you can look at and be like, okay, that probably deserves some sort of nerf. It's probably overtuned, and that's why it took a hit, right? That's something that you shouldn't really be complaining about. I think it's pretty reasonable. And also, it doesn't make it so your defensive layers are garbage. You can still run Defiance banner, you can still run Determination, you can still get quite good phys mitigation, and you still survive while mapping, but it makes it less overpowered, right? And less of a ubiquitous thing, and more of a, okay, other options aren't so completely useless in comparison that I won't even consider them, right? So I think that's fine. Wind Dancer got buffed. This is probably still going to be in the realm of not many builds use it because of the awkwardness of it. Same thing with Arrow Dancing. Same thing with Ward. These are all sort of defensive layers that got buffs, but they're still probably underpowered enough to not be relevant, would be my guess. Grasping Mail. This is not a newer player thing. This is the mere tier player. This is the guy who's giga investing, and this is a overpowered mod. It's not even close how good Global Defenses is in comparison to other mods. Taking it from 100% to 50% honestly is pretty reasonable. Most of the Breach mods on a large extent are basically lesser versions of their Breach item counterpart in a lot of these things, except for Grasping Mail was exactly the same Breach mod that's on Skin of the Loyal, right? It's a busted overpowered mod, arguably the strongest mod in the entire affix in the entire game. Yeah, it probably deserved a nerf. I wouldn't complain about that, and don't pretend new players are getting this. That's ridiculous. Gravicious mod. This one's a side grade. This one is basically nerfing Righteous Fire or builds that could do Ghost Dance, builds that could do Divine Shield, builds that basically said, okay, I have 6k life, here, let me add 1000 Energy Shield on top of that for one affix on my gear slot. Yeah, it was pretty strong, it was pretty busted, and it made those builds a little bit OP in terms of how easily they could scale their defenses. But although we lose that, we get something that's quite interesting and also strong, which is Fizz taken as Fire and Lightning up to 12% just with the Benchcraft. This is almost as good as T1 Fizz taken as on any of the Influence mods. And on top of that, you just have to Benchcraft it. This is still a very strong mod. It gives you nice defenses, but it's not so overwhelmingly strong that it's the only option sort of thing. It's no matter what gear I'm using I'm putting on the gain life is yes. Now I have the choice of, oh, do I want some fizz mitigation? Do I want some extra life scaling? Do I want to get extra flat armor and evasion into my build? Stuff like that. It makes it more of a choice rather than a ubiquitous option, right? This is something I kind of believe to be the case of, if it's so good that it drowns out all the other options, it's not something that's healthy for the game, because PoE is a game of choice, a game of creativity, a game of solving problems. And if it's so obvious that one choice is just so much better than everything else, that choice is clearly overpowered, is clearly overtuned. It needs to be nerfed, it needs to be adjusted, it needs to be removed, whatever that may be, right? But it can't stay in its current state because it's stale, it's boring, it's uninteresting, it's uninspired, and in the end, it doesn't make the game a better game. It makes it meh. Blind effect. This is a buff to defenses. I've looked into blind a little bit more now, and this actually could be somewhat interesting to scale into, which I might consider doing in future builds. Mind over matter. This one's relatively, it's a nice little buff to mind over matter. Not big enough, I think, to help mana builds. I think mana builds definitely still need more than this, but it's still a buff. Fortification, that's a buff. So going through this, you have spell suppress was nerfed to not be ubiquitous. Defiance banner was nerfed so it's not ubiquitous. And gain life is ES was nerfed so it's not ubiquitous. And then you had like 8 other buffs. So when you go through and you say, oh, all defenses were nerfed into the ground, this is a clear exaggeration. You can still get good defenses in your builds. And new players, none of this is hurting new players. Arguably, it's helping new players. For the most part, though, it's a net zero gain. I just hate the whole argument when people start being like, you're hurting the new player, which you're not the new player. I'm not the new player, and what we're talking about doesn't relate to the new player. And it's such a stupid, worthless conversation or argument to make. It's just kind of I don't know, I get tired of it. You see it all the time of, this hurts the new player, but they're just talking about something that hurts them, and they're complaining about something that hurts them, and they're not the new player, but they want to fight for the new player, but they're just fighting for themselves. It gets old, right? The other thing I want to talk about is the react meta of to just go with the drama. You see everybody freaking out, so you're gonna freak out too, or the clickbait of it of, oh, it's a dead league from Quinn69, or calling the manifesto pointless and boring. I think overall, like, I've watched, like, for example, I watched Zizern's video. He's pretty relatively reasonable in his response, but to go with like the clickbait of calling the manifesto pointless and boring and feeding into the clear overreaction to stuff, I think is a bit ridiculous. It still had relevant nerfs that were, honestly, I think nerfs that were important to Zizaran. For example, the spell suppress thing. I think on many times I heard him upset that the spell suppress was a mandatory thing you had to do every single build, ubiquitous, right? Which they changed that. I don't know if they changed it in a way he wanted, though, right? So stuff like that. This overreaction meta, I think, is a little bit ridiculous. The other thing I want to talk about, this is just more of a personal pet peeve. The Necromancer. The Necromancer. Every single league, for as long as I've played this game, Necromancer, week 1, number 1 played ascendancy. Every single time. And it's generally, maybe sometimes a Saboteur would beat it by a percent or two, or maybe a champion would beat it by a percent or two or something, but every single league, there is one ascendancy that's always been there my entire playtime of the game. And that's because minions have always been strong. They've always been much stronger than most other builds in the game. And they've been very gearless. They haven't needed gear. Other builds need gear. And this patch is basically like, hey, we're going to make it so minions start to need gear more. And they're going to get nerfed in a few ways, but also buffed in a few ways. And the response is this visceral, crying, complaining, necromancers are dead response that is so far removed from the fact their builds are still strong and they're still so far above the bottom. There's like 19 ascendancies. If this was a balanced, perfectly game, every ascendancy would be like 5% player base, right? But you have ascendancies that are 0.1%, 0.6%, 0.6%, 1%. For every one trickster, you have 200 necromancers. And you're gonna come over here and cry and complain like it's the end of the world, like the world is ending, like your builds have been deleted from existence, and you have no idea what it's like to have a build that's actually bad or actually not viable. Because I can guarantee you, after these nerfs, Necromancer, still very strong, still probably arguably top 3 ascendancies in the game. It's just one of those things that it just gets old, because I see this basically every time Necromancer gets any sort of tangential nerf or any slight nick, they lose their minds. And it's just crazy. The funny thing about this, for me at least, is I see, many posts, Necromancer this, yada yada yada, Necromancer, blah blah blah, Necromancer's dying. And I know Righteous Fire very well. And Righteous Fire took a 30% damage nerf to Fire Trap, which is how RF builds had damage. They took the Gravicious mod. The build that needed Gravicious mod the most took a nerf. The build that uses Melding of the Flesh the most, guess what it is? It's RF. RF took a ton of nerfs, but I don't see RF complaining, because RF players maybe realize, yeah, they deserved a nerf. This was realistic. This made sense. Fire Trap was overpowered. If I look at every single dot skill in the game, Fire Trap did 40% more damage. Maybe it deserved to get nerfed 30%. And I don't go and I don't freak out and complain, because I know my build was strong. I know it was overpowered. I know it deserves some level of nerf, and I'm okay with that. But to be a Necromancer, to be basically on the top, and then complain so much is just so... I find it so, crazy. For example, you have Necromancers who, their strongest build right now is Summon Skeletons, for example. 10% of the player base, it's their league starter, yada, yada, yada. That's the skill that's overpowered. What happened in these patch notes is they took Summon Skeletons and they said, we're dunking on Summon Skeletons, we're nerfing it into the ground. But then they went and buffed a lot of other minion skills, like Summon Raging Spirits, like Animate Weapon with Poison, like a lot of the Golem builds had some significant damage buffs to them. And there are changes where it's like, okay, maybe I can make these other builds work. Maybe I can create something with this. You know how much a melee player would give to see Lightning Strike dunked on and have Molten Strike and Sunder and all the other melee skills get some interesting things happen to them and become relevant? Melee players would be ecstatic to have a change like this. They wouldn't be complaining and crying over this like it's the end of the world, because this would shake up their builds. It would give them ability, breathe a fresh life into their meta of maybe having some skills that they've had been dead for so long become more interesting. And that's what happened here. And the other thing is, a lot of these nerfs are either side grades or stuff where arguably things got stronger. For example, the +3 minion gems, trading that for +2 global gems. This is a scenario where all the builds that didn't have a GG mirror tier minion helmet basically got buffed. I don't think it's going to be that unfeasible to get a helmet that has +2 minion gems and just throw on a crafted life. I think that's going to be very feasible, and that's going to be a fairly solid buff to the vast majority of minion builds, sort of thing. And they have the nerve to complain about this, because their mirror tier 8-link, 9-link helmet lost its +3, and now it only has +2. Boo-hoo, cry me a river. It's ridiculous. Sorry, that's my Necromancer rant. I just see it every single time that Necromancers get any slight nerf. It's more than any other build archetype in the game. They have the largest capacity to complain, even though their builds are straight up the strongest builds in the game. And they have been for every league I've ever played Path of Exile. It's basically playing Path of Exile on easy mode. And they have the nerve to complain when there are other builds in the game all the way down here getting no changes at all to their archetype, getting nothing, getting no love, and you have the nerve, the nerve to blow up like this. Yeah, we're getting a Trickster rework. Hopefully it's good. I'm all on copium for Trickster, right? But there's still things like Chieftain's change was a joke. Juggernaut's change, honestly, was just kind of bleh. And then Slayer, Guardian, Gladiator, all these Ascendancies down here, they're in a pretty rough spot. Ascendancy picks up like actual like late game, right? Because you have, you know, aura stackers, it becomes more relevant, but like that's one build. And there's still so much down here that if you're all the way up here, don't come crying to me. Don't come crying to Reddit. Don't. You just don't have the right to complain. You really don't. It's basically the privileged kid that had, I don't know, his weekly allowance of $100 taken away, and he thinks he's living in poverty now or something. It's ridiculous to me. That's maybe a bad analogy. Maybe I'm too hard on necromancers. Maybe I'm crazy, and they don't freak out like this every time they take any slight nerf and then still be the strongest build, some of the strongest builds in the game next patch. But come on. I think we all could agree. We go back in history, this happens like pretty much every time. And it's just a little bit crazy, especially when you actually like look at the changes made. The vast majority of the stuff is basically shifting power, so that way necromancers actually have to get like gear. That's the majority of what happened. I think the only change that I could reasonably like agree with a minion player and being upset about is survivability on minions. I don't think you should have to fight so hard to have your minions survive in fights. I think that's ridiculous. But the other stuff like complaining about damage, complaining about that sort of stuff, no, that's not a relevant complaint. Your damage has always been quite fine / overpowered. So I don't know, that's my hot takes on the Manifesto drama and where we are in the current set of things. All in all, there were some other changes in there, like for example people complaining about reservation efficiency and people complaining about Omni nerf, corrupting fever nerf, stuff like that. Things like case by case. Corrupting fever, that one kind of sucks because that build is like unplayable now. You can't really scale corrupting fever because you have so much life cost. That one's unfortunate. Omni, that's the most overpowered build archetype in the game, and it makes every build the same. You're stacking 3 attributes on all your gear and you're just having billions of DPS. Oh, guess what? Now you have 500 million of DPS instead of 1 billion DPS. I think you're going to be fine. That one, it's like an overreaction if you're crying about Omni. And then there's other things like the reservation mastery change, where they just removed it. 85% of players are using that mastery. It's probably broken. It's probably overpowered. It probably either needed a nerf or to get removed. Stuff like this, where it's every player has to pick it up. It's not a choice. It's not interesting. It might as well just be a base stat that every single character comes with, because you're not thinking, you're not changing your build, you're not doing anything unique. Every single build runs this type of thing. It's not going to be healthy for the game, right? If it's something that's so mandatory. And it's something that you can still work around the problem. You can still solve it in other ways. So taking that away just frees you up to be more creative, frees you up to choose other things, to be like, okay, I don't need to force the aura clusters into every single build I play because they're not as overpowered, and it gives you more freedom that way, right? That's the way you have to look at it to be able to understand why they're changing that or why they're taking that. It's shifting how the build is now, or the game is a harder problem to solve, or it's more interesting to solve. I guess it would be a better way to state it. So that's my video. Had a lot of hot takes, probably upset a lot of people, and this video is not going to do well, but I had to get that off my chest. It was something that was boiling inside of me. Anyways, thank you for watching the video. As always, take care, Exiles.